Drive out the corruption! The land is ours!
Welcome to our explainer. Today we're diving headfirst into one of the absolute most challenging, controversial, and, let's be honest, deeply uncomfortable concepts in all of ancient literature. We're talking about the biblical practice of the ban. We're tackling a comprehensive historical and theological analysis of divine judgment in the Old Testament. And look, just to set our ground rules right away so we're all on the same page, we are stepping strictly into the role of impartial guides here. We aren't endorsing a specific theology, and we certainly aren't here to justify historical violence. What we are doing is reconstructing the ancient worldview. We want to understand exactly how the original authors and their original audiences reconciled this kind of severe judgment with their deeply held concept of a loving God. It's a huge topic, so let's get right into it. Because we're unpacking some incredibly heavy concepts of ancient total warfare. Here is our roadmap for the explainer. First, we'll look at the ultimate cognitive dissonance. 2. Redefining warfare and love. 3. Anatomy of ancient judgment. 4. Corporate guilt and children. 5. Radical mercy and equal standards. And finally, 6. The modern internal battlefield. Okay, part 1. The ultimate cognitive dissonance. 2 incompatible realities. We absolutely have to start by validating the profound, visceral shock that any modern reader feels when encountering these historical documents. I mean, you read about a creator who is defined by perfect, unconditional love, right? And that's a very comforting thought. It's what draws people in. But then you turn the page, literally just a few pages later in the text, and this exact same deity issues a military command for total annihilation. How does a deity defined by unconditional love issue a military command for absolute destruction? This is the ultimate cognitive dissonance we are staring down today. We are talking about the men, the women, the children, the livestock, absolutely nothing left breathing. When you read that, it sounds like a complete oxymoron. It feels like two entirely incompatible realities are existing in the exact same ancient text. And the truth is, to actually understand it, rather than just projecting our own modern 21st century assumptions onto an ancient Near Eastern document, we have to completely step out of our world and reconstruct their framework. We have to see it the way they saw it. That brings us to part 2. Redefining warfare and love, translating the ancient worldview. Let's see how this builds. If we're actually going to grasp the internal logic of this history, we've got to start with the language itself. We have to translate ancient concepts into modern realities. The English translation, the ban, is honestly profoundly inadequate. When we hear ban today, it sounds sterile, doesn't it? It sounds like getting your account suspended on a social media platform or being told you can't enter a restaurant. But in ancient Hebrew, the word was herem. And herem meant a concept of absolute devotion, an absolute sentence of divine quarantine. It meant that a city or a group of people was permanently, irreversibly consecrated to the divine realm. They were completely removed from the mundane world. And practically speaking, that meant they were utterly and completely removed from human use or human profit. It's a total, unyielding separation. And this brilliantly illustrates the massive difference between what's happening here and the rest of the ancient world. Think about standard ancient warfare for a second. The Romans, the Babylonians, the Assyrians. Why did they go to war? They went to war to get rich. Period. It was a massive economic engine driven by greed, by plunder. They were taking gold, stealing livestock, capturing enslaved labor, and building massive empires. It was an investment. But under herem, under the ban, ancient Israelite soldiers expended massive military resources. They risked their own lives. And for what? Zero economic benefit, literally none. They were strictly forbidden from taking a single coin, a single sheep, or a single piece of clothing. This was completely divorced from traditional imperialistic greed. It was massive risk with zero reward. To really wrap our modern minds around this, think of it like this. Imagine a massive police or FDA raid on a black market warehouse, and this warehouse is just packed full of intentionally poisoned baby formula. The confiscation of that lethal product is strictly an act of public safety, right? It's a quarantine. You have to destroy it to save lives. Now, imagine if the police chief leading that raid decides to quietly take a few crates of that poisoned formula home to sell and profit on the side. That would be catastrophic ethical treason. He completely compromises the entire ethical purpose of the quarantine and becomes just as corrupt as the black market dealers he's arresting. In the ancient text, taking spoils from a city under the ban, which is exactly what a soldier named Achan did at Jericho, was treated as literal high treason. It was an act of profaning a divine judgment just to satisfy personal greed. But to truly bridge this gap between their world and ours, we also have to redefine love. Today, we tend to equate love with sentimentality. We think of it as this soft, unconditional affirmation of basically everything, a very live and let live vibe. But in this ancient framework, true love is inextricably bound to justice. It's a concept known as holy love. Think about it. If a judge truly loves the innocent and the vulnerable, he must fiercely, actively hate and oppose the abuse and exploitation that threatens those vulnerable people. In this theology, just sitting back and permitting systemic evil to flourish without consequence, that isn't love. That is an act of supreme cruelty. God's love and God's justice aren't opposing forces pulling in opposite directions. They are the exact same attribute, just expressed in different directions. Let's move on to part 3, Anatomy of Ancient Judgment, Historical Triggers, and Divine Patience. It is definitely time to dismantle the popular assumption that this was just some sudden, erratic outburst of divine ethnic cleansing. The immediate modern assumption, and it's a fair one to make at first glance, is that this was just one tribe deciding they were racially superior to another tribe and using God as an excuse to wipe them out. But the source material pushes back incredibly hard on that narrative when you look at the actual historical triggers. If you just read a quick summary of the conquest of Canaan, it feels really impulsive. It feels like God woke up one Tuesday and just ordered an annihilation out of nowhere. But if you actually read the timeline in the text, it portrays an agonizingly patient deity. All the way back in Genesis 15, God tells Abraham that his descendants won't actually inherit the land for centuries. Why? Because, quote, the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. God literally waits over 400 years for this metaphorical cup of moral guilt to overflow. 400 years. To put that in perspective, 400 years ago for us was the early 1600s. It's a massive amount of time. It's like a farmer waiting years and years, trying every possible method to save a diseased orchard, and only taking an axe to the trees when the blight threatens to spread and kill absolutely everything in the region. The judgment was the absolute last resort. And the explicit parameters laid out in the text proved that this judgment was triggered strictly by moral rot, not by bloodlines, not by language, not by ethnicity. Deuteronomy 20 explicitly states the trigger for the ban, that they teach you not to do after all their abominations. So what were those abominations? We aren't just talking about a neighboring tribe praying to a different statue or having different cultural customs. The archaeological and textual evidence points to horrifying practices. We're talking about fully normalized, institutionalized infant sacrifice to the bronze god Molech. We're talking about exploitative sacred prostitution as a core part of their religious and economic system. It was a deeply entrenched systemic moral rot. And it was so aggressive that it threatened to spiritually and culturally contaminate the entire region. We see this targeted behavior-based judgment again later with the Midianites in the book of Numbers. This wasn't random animosity against a neighbor. A diviner named Balaam realized he couldn't curse Israel externally with magic, so he engineered a chilling, highly calculated strategy of internal spiritual sabotage. It's basically a Trojan horse. He advised the Midianites to infiltrate the Israelite camp, strategically seduce the men, and draw them into the idolatrous, exploitative sacrifices of Baal Peor. And it worked. It led to a massive catastrophe from within, leaving 24,000 dead. The subsequent judgment on Midian wasn't because they were Midianite, it was a direct reciprocal response to active operatives who executed a lethal, weaponized strategy designed to make Israel self-destruct from the inside out.
Which brings us to part 4, corporate guilt and children, deconstructing modern individualism.
We now must approach the absolute hardest, most gut-wrenching question in the entire text: how children fit into this severe ancient framework. Even with the context of systemic rot, even with the context of spiritual sabotage, reading about the inclusion of infants in the ban is undeniably devastating. Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. It is brutal to read. The text itself doesn't even celebrate it. You see later prophets continuously weeping over these kinds of judgments. But the text does have a specific ancient logical framework for why it happened. To even begin to process this, we have to completely, entirely abandon our 21st century hyper-individualism. We live in a world that believes entirely in isolated identity and private guilt. If my neighbor commits a terrible crime, I don't go to jail for it. My kids don't go to jail for it. But ancient societies didn't think like that. They operated entirely on corporate identity. The foundational unit of society wasn't the individual, it was the household. It was a sprawling, interconnected, tribal kinship web. Children were not viewed as independent entities with personal autonomy who could just choose their own path. They were viewed as indivisible extensions of the corporate whole. They inherited the worldview, the obligations, the debts, and the spiritual alignment of their collective society. You were your tribe.
The text essentially views these ancient, corrupt societies as condemned high-rise buildings. Think of a city building inspector who walks into a massive skyscraper and finds that the concrete foundation is completely shattered and the load-bearing beams are entirely rusted through. He has to condemn and demolish the entire building to prevent a catastrophic, deadly collapse. Now, when he signs that demolition order, he isn't declaring that a perfectly clean, brand new brick on the 4th floor is personally evil, right? He is declaring that the structure itself is fundamentally lethal and cannot be saved. In this ancient framework, the judgment fell on the societal structure itself. It wasn't because an infant held conscious moral guilt, an infant obviously doesn't, but because the system they were embedded in was inescapably toxic and structurally doomed. Because think about what happens when horrific evils like child sacrifice scale up, when it becomes the actual engine of the economy, when it's enforced by the local government and demanded by the religious institutions. At that point, it ceases to be a private, isolated sin that one bad person is doing in secret. The systemic rot becomes inescapable. It's in the water supply, so to speak. The text is arguing that the entire societal structure of these specific nations was so irrevocably woven with these destructive practices that the system had to be entirely dismantled to protect all future life in the region.
Okay, part 5, radical mercy, equal standards, the absence of ethnic favoritism.
This section reveals a massive, narrative-altering twist that proves this entire concept was never, ever about ethnic superiority. Because think about it. If this was simply blind racial hatred, if it was just closed ethnic favoritism, then bloodlines would have entirely sealed a person's fate. If you had Canaanite blood, you'd be done. There would be zero exceptions ever. But the text actually goes out of its way to provide profound, radical exceptions. The door of radical mercy was relentlessly open to any outsider who rejected the condemned systems. Take Rahab, for example. She's a Canaanite living right in the middle of Jericho, the first city under the ban. But she rejects her system, helps Israel, and she is completely spared and integrated into the nation. Then you have Ruth, a Moabite woman from a nation Israel despised, who not only joins Israel but becomes the great-grandmother of King David. You have Naaman, a Syrian military commander who is healed of leprosy, and you have the entire brutal Assyrian capital city of Nineveh, which is entirely spared from judgment simply because they listened to a warning and repented. These stories totally fundamentally subvert the ancient tribal paradigm. It wasn't about race, it was about spiritual alignment.
And crucially, what happened to the insiders? What happened to the Israelites themselves? They received absolutely no free pass. This is so important. Centuries later, when the kings and the people of Israel adopted the exact same abominations, setting up idols, shedding innocent blood, exploiting the poor, and yes, even practicing child sacrifice themselves in the Valley of Hinnom, they were judged by the exact same uncompromising standard. The divine judge exercised that same incredible patience, sending prophet after prophet for years to warn them. But when they stubbornly refused to listen,
the judgment fell just as brutally on them. Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was leveled, and the surviving population was dragged away into the Babylonian exile. The standard was absolute, and it had total, unyielding disregard for ethnic identity. If you act like the corrupt system, you face the corrupt system. Let's bring this all together in Part 6, the modern internal battlefield, New Testament shifts, and reflections. As we bring this explainer to a close, we really need to understand how the New Testament completely reshapes this reality for the modern era. Because I know you might feel a massive spiritual whiplash going from these severe ancient military commands in the Old Testament to Jesus standing on a hill saying, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." It feels like two different worlds. But the analysis of the text argues that the New Testament doesn't erase or apologize for the intense justice of God in the past. Instead, it says that all of it culminates at a single historical point. The relocated battlefield is the cross. Here, the absolute unyielding seriousness of divine judgment against systemic evil literally collides with divine self-sacrificial love. Because of this monumental shift, the era of the physical ban is permanently over, done. These ancient texts must never, ever be weaponized to justify modern physical violence or holy wars. The battlefield has relocated from ancient walled cities strictly to the internal landscape of the human heart. The call for people today is to enact a ban, a total quarantine upon our own internal greed, our own malice, and our own participation in exploitation. I want to leave you with one final, deeply unsettling thought to mull over as we finish. We really, really love our modern hyper-individualism, don't we? We love to believe that our private choices, our daily consumption habits, and our actions only affect ourselves. We like to think we are islands. But when we look at the cascading crises facing our world today, things like massive environmental collapse, systemic economic inequalities, or the terrifying normalization of human exploitation in global supply chains, we have to ask ourselves, does our modern individualism actually blind us to our own corporate guilt today? Are we buying the poisoned baby formula and pretending we aren't part of the problem? What if the ancient, deeply uncomfortable idea of corporate responsibility is exactly the concept we need to relearn to save our own society? Has our absolute obsession with hyper-individualism blinded us to the reality that we are still participating in and maybe even building condemned systemic structures? It's a heavy question, but you have to keep asking the hard questions. You have to keep seeking the why behind the history. And as always, never be afraid to dive deep. Thanks for joining us for this explainer.